If you've been waiting for a video that talks about how to use time and date in your templates, then your time has come. This is the next video in my ongoing series on mastering Home Assistant templates. And there's a lot to talk about. We'll talk about the Home Assistant provided entities that you can use to bend time to your will, or at least in your templates. We'll talk about changing time formats and cover things like when to use as datetime and as timestamp. And we'll cover how to do that all-important timestamp math, so we know when something is going to happen or when it did happen. And of course, we'll walk through some examples on how you can leverage these templates. So stick around because we could all use some more time when automating the boring stuff. If you saw my last video on templates, and based on the stats, not many of you did. But for those that did, I said the next video in this series was supposed to be all about state-based templates. But while I was scripting that video, I realized time and date templates needed more time. In fact, this probably should have been broken into smaller videos in an effort to improve viewer retention. But in any case, here we are. Who cares about video metrics, right? Anyway, this whole video is based on time and date in templates. But before we get into the technical stuff, I want to set some expectations. This might be the most complex topic in terms of templates, so I'm going to start with an apology. I'm not confident I can explain any of this clearly. With that said, this is not meant to be a definitive guide. My goal is to cover as much of the basics so that in the next videos we can talk more about how we use this date and time in our templates. So this is going to be more focused on the Jinja and less on how to create new entities. Although we are going to cover some use cases where these templates are useful. And this, of course, is from the perspective of using these templates in a smart home, not a programming guide. Like the other videos in this series, this is meant to be a resource, so there are timestamps down below so you can jump right to the information you need. So grab your favorite beverage and let's start with now. Time, of course, is relative. It's one of those things that makes all of this time and date stuff hard. But to get started, we typically need to know the time now. There are, of course, lots of time and date entities inside of Home Assistant that can get you that information. But when I need to know what time it is now, I turn to now. Okay, before we get started with this, I wanted to do just a quick refresh because it's been a while since we've talked about templates. So I'm going to spend a lot of time in this template editor, which you can find under Developer Tools. And it is a real handy way for testing your templates prior to using them inside of Home Assistant. If you've watched the previous videos, then this is going to be stuff you already know. But just in case, when we deal with templates, we're going to be using two different sets of tags. The first is this double curly brace tag, which is essentially like a print statement if you're familiar with that in programming. Whatever you put in the middle of these two tags, Home Assistant or specifically Jinja is going to evaluate the equation that you put in here and provide some output. So if we did something where we use the states function to get the state where we include states and then in the parentheses the name of the entity, this double curly brace will return the current state of that entity. And of course, this double curly brace expects that whatever you put in between those tags is going to actually produce an output. So if you were to just put the name of an entity here, it's not going to do anything because this doesn't tell it what to do with that entity. So in that case, you get an undefined error. So of course, anytime you want to use the double curly brace, you need to make sure that whatever is inside that evaluates or provides some kind of output. And we talked a lot about the different things you can do with this in a couple of the previous videos. You'll see more of it in this video and of course in the future videos where we talk about building template entities. The other tag I want to talk about is this curly brace percent tag. We're going to talk about this one some in this video as well, but this one is meant not to output the value, but meant more for Jinja. And you would put programming logic inside of these tags to help define your template. And you can, of course, mix both of them, which we will definitely do as we start to talk about building template entities. But now let's talk about now, because that's what we came to do in this section. Because the now function can help us determine the time now.
What happened to then?
We passed that.
When?
Just now. We're at now.
Which is extremely helpful in our templates, because oftentimes especially working with time and date, we need to know the difference between 2 points of time. And a lot of times we're going to be starting with now, or need to know where a particular time is in time and space based on what time it is now. Python and Jinja provide us a handy function for doing that, and it's simply now. And it gives us the full time. So it gives us the date and the time down to milliseconds, and it includes our time zone offset. So it's extremely helpful and very versatile. But as you can see, it also doesn't constantly update. It does update every minute, which is okay because in most cases, you're not going to be using this to print the current time anywhere, so you don't need that kind of precision. But I do think that's an important caveat to mention. Now, one of the handy features of Python and some of the other programming languages is the ability to use dot notation, almost like those pipe filters that we've used already in the previous videos in our Jinja templates. And we can filter now. So if we wanted to get just the current hour, we could type our now function .hour, and it's going to get us the current hour. As you can see, it's currently 8 a.m. when I'm recording this screen capture. But you also have access to year this way, month, day, minute, second, all of the good stuff, which means this can come in really handy for decision logic based on the current time. For example, we can replace this with this template right here. And as you can see, we're using those curly brace % signs along with some if statements to do some decision logic based on the current time. This is one of the templates I use in a lot of my notifications so that I can add a greeting or an intro to my Audible notifications, specifically my text-to-speech that gets said through the various speakers in my house. And in this case, we're using now to determine whether we should say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. And of course, as you can see, now uses military time or 24-hour time. So another caveat to keep in mind if you're going to be using this in this type of decision logic. So real quickly, just to go over what this is doing, we're saying that if the current hour is less than 12, then we're going to use good morning. But then we have a second if-else statement, which in Python is written el if, else if the hour is greater than or equal to 12, and the hour is less than 17, then good afternoon, and then for everything else, good evening. And you may have already picked this up, but if you use hour specifically, as you can see, it doesn't use the leading 0. So another thing to keep in mind if you're going to use this in your templates. And while this function works really well for decision logic like that, one other way I like to use now is for saving the current time, so I can use it later. For example, I have a young kid that has been known to get up at 2:30 in the morning and sneak into the theater to watch Netflix until we tell him it's time to get dressed for school. So I started tracking when he got up using a motion sensor in his room. So in the morning, I'd get an idea of how long he's been up. And to store that, I use a date time helper. Date time helpers and Home Assistant are of course extremely useful, and I've done some previous videos where I talk about how I use them to provide an easy way to update trigger times for automations like these daily announcements here, but I also use them to store time and date of certain events. Sometimes it's just time, like this one here where I record the time that my son got up today, or it could be recording a full timestamp so I know exactly at what point something happened. And if you don't know, you can set up a date time helper by going to Settings, Devices and Services, and then by clicking on Helpers. Then in the bottom right, you can say Create Helper, and then just choose Date or Time. And this is where you get to specify a name, an icon you want, and what type of date time helper you want. Whether you want it to just be a date, whether you want it to be just time, or whether you want it to include both date and time. But let's flip back over to that template panel. So input date time helpers have a service that allows you to set the time, which makes it handy to automate. And in a minute, I'll show you what that automation looks like. But as you can see, this input date time helper that I used to store when my son awoke this morning has just the time in hour, minutes, and seconds. And I use that now function to help me do it. So flipping over to my configuration, this one is built using the automation UI, so it's going to look a little different because I'm showing you the raw YAML here. And this automation does a couple of different things, but what I want to focus on is this surface call here, where we set the date time of an input datetime helper. And as you can see under the data section, the time attribute, I'm using a template to get the current time using that now function. And another function where I pass the current value of now to this strf time function, which is string from time, because the input datetime helpers need the value that you store there to be in a string, and now just outputs a date time type. So if I was to just get rid of this and fire this automation, I would get an error. So we need to convert the current value of now to a string. So we'll jump back over to the template panel and I'll walk you through how we can use this formatting function. So as we said, the function now will get us the current time, but it includes the date and the time, including milliseconds and the time zone offset, which we don't need. And in my automation, I used a template that looked like this, which as you can see, just gets the hour and the minutes. This shorthand right here, or these formatting options, are Python time-based formatting options. And I'll leave a link in the description to where you can see all of these, because you can use these to put this time and date entity into pretty much any format you would need. So if you want to save the current time, this template right here would work. And we could even add seconds by adding a $%S. And the case here does matter, because as you can see, it's 12:58 right now. If I change this to lowercase m, it switches this to 12:07, which isn't the minutes, but the numeric value of the current month. And if I was to change this to lowercase h, I would get the 3-digit abbreviation of the current month. So again, case here matters. But if you have an input datetime helper that you want to save the current time, you can use this template right here. And if you have one in which you're storing both the time and date, you can use something like this, which puts our now in this format, where we have just the date and then the hour and minutes. Again, you could add the seconds, but for something where you're just storing the current time, this precision of seconds may not really matter. Both of these will work as templates setting the time of a current input datetime helper. If you have a time-based datetime helper though, doing something like this won't work, because as you can see, this time format here includes the milliseconds, and an input datetime helper doesn't have a way to store that. So if you try to use this template to set the time of an input datetime helper, it's going to give you an error. But what if you need to use a specific time on the current day? And in this case, I'm thinking specifically about those handy history stat sensors that want either a start time or an end time. The History Stats platform is one that comes in handy, especially if you want to know a little more about your entities, or specifically specific states of your entities. If you ever wanted to know how long you were home this week, or how much time you spent watching Netflix, this is the sensor you want. Unfortunately, these are not something you can set up right now inside of the UI, although I suspect eventually that will probably change. But in any case, to set these up, we have to provide it with a name of what we want our new sensor to be, an entity ID of a sensor we want to track, the state we want to track, the type of sensor this is going to be, whether this is going to be a count of time or a count of how many times that particular state happened, or a ratio. It always defaults to time, so technically if you're just tracking time, you don't need to include that. But you're going to need a start and an end time, because History Stats looks at a specific time period. And as you can see in this example in the documentation, we can use this replace function after now to get a specific point in time. So as you can see, this starts at now, where they've replaced the hour to 0, the minute to 0 and the second to 0, and it ends at the current time. So in this case, this history stats sensor would be checking to see how long this particular lamp was on from midnight of the current day to now. So if we flip back over to our template page and we drop that in, as you can see, this has taken the current date and reset it to midnight. And you, of course, can replace any parts of this. So the date, the year, or the month as well. And just to show another way of using this with that history stats sensor, I have a history stats sensor here that tracks how many times my doorbell was pressed yesterday, in which I provided it the entity I want to track, which is this binary sensor, front door ding, which is pointed to my Ring video doorbell. And I want to know how many times the state of this binary sensor turned to on. So the type is count. And since I'm tracking yesterday, I set the end time to midnight as of today and the duration 24 hours. So this, we use this template here to choose the end time, and then it's going to be looking at the previous 24 hours. Those are some ways that you can use the time right now in your templates, which will definitely come in handy in just a bit. But before we move on, I want to point out a couple of other time and date entities built into Home Assistant that represent specific points in time. So far in this video, we've been talking a lot about Python-specific time and date entities, specifically now. But Home Assistant has some built-in time and date entities that they provide to you, although these aren't provided by default, which is probably why only 3.6% of active installations are reporting that they're using this specific integration. But in some of the examples that are going to be coming up, I do refer to some of these. So if you haven't set up this platform or integration inside of Home Assistant, you may want to do that, especially if you see something coming up that is useful to your smart home setup. Of course, this one isn't something that gets set up in the UI, so we have to add this to one of our YAML files. And of course, depending on how you've set up your Home Assistant configuration, you might be able to add this in multiple places. For example, they say here the configuration.yaml file. And we could in fact just copy this and flip over to our configuration file. If you don't have a sensor colon section here, you could just paste this in right like that and be fine. Or you could add your own sensor.yaml file and put sensor in here with something like !include space sensor.yaml. Or you could do like I did and do this include directory merge list followed by a directory name. Then you could add as many YAML files in that directory as you want, as long as they all include sensor entities. In any case, once you've added that to your configuration and restarted, then you could reference those entities with something like this. This sensor.date entity is one of those provided by the integration, and as you can see, it returns the date, same as the now function. This, however, isn't a time date format, so you wouldn't be able to do the handy things like replace the specific month using the output of this. Although technically you could, because it is just a string and there is ways to replace different values, but I think you'll end up making things more complicated. In any case, know that those entities are available to you, and if you're not using them and you see something in just a bit that makes you want to use these entities, that you set those up. Most of the time though, in my templates, I just refer to now. And if I need the specific date, can use that date function. And of course, there's a couple of built-in time date stamps inside of each of your entities, and that is last updated and last changed. And while these are technically attributes of the entities, you can't get to them using the state_attr function. So we have to use the dot notation like this to reference those two entities. And while you do want to avoid using this dot notation in most of your templates because it can lead to errors when there's no value, for most of your entities or all of your entities, these should never be unknown. So you should be safe there. In any case, when you need to reference these, you can reference them just like this. As you can see, these two timestamps for this entity are different. And that's because these two entities are showing two different things. So last updated refers to the last time the state or an attribute of this entity was updated. Last change refers to the time that this entity's state changed. So if you were using these inside of your templates and you wanted to know the last time Home Assistant interacted with this entity, you could use the last updated. If you wanted to know the last time this entity's state changed, you would use last changed. And of course, these can come in handy in lots of different scenarios. Okay, of course, we're just scratching the surface in terms of time and date in these templates. But let's move on to figuring out how much time has passed between 2 points in time. This is where we get into having to compare 2 different points in time and mathing some timestamps. If you remember from 3rd grade math class, in order to get the right answer, all the values in our mathematical equation need to be the same unit of measurement. So in this section, we're going to talk about how to convert various timestamps to the same unit of measurement so that we can check if something happened in the past, or figure out how long ago it happened, or even how long we have until something happens. And we'll even be able to check if it happened at a specific time. We'll also talk about the difference between as datetime and as timestamp, and when to use them. But first, let's talk about something called Unix time. If you've seen a timestamp that looks like this, then you've seen Unix time. And what this is the number of seconds that have elapsed since January 1st, 1970 UTC, or at least the number of seconds that have elapsed as of recording this video. The great thing about Unix time is it makes it real easy to do timestamp math. For example, if you have the Unix time now, as you watch this video and subtract the Unix time I just showed, you'll know how many seconds have passed since I recorded that screen capture. A big part of what we do in these templates is converting date and time to and from this Unix timestamp, because it makes it easy to compare 2 points of time. But you can also find it in some of the entities as well. Just know that anytime you need to do math, if you can, convert the 2 time and or dates you need to compare into Unix time. Then the math becomes simple subtraction. So with that, let's get mathing. Okay, let's start with as datetime and as timestamp. Both of these are used to convert values when working with your time and dates, and it probably isn't too clear on when to use them. And before someone calls me out for leaving some specific context out, this is more of how I use them and keep them straight for the purpose of creating smart home templates. And this video is not meant to be Python training. Anyway, as datetime is used anytime you want to convert a string of text like this date 2023-05-20 or a Unix timestamp like we just talked about into an actual datetime object. Now, it isn't completely clear here in this example that that's what's going on, because here in this template, I just put a string of text. But when you're working with date and time, there are some functions that allow you to change time around, move forward a month, move back a day, things like that you can't do when it's simply text. In those cases, to be able to use those types of functions inside of our templates, the value that we need to work with needs to be an actual date time type, not just a string of text. And so a lot of times when we're using this as date time, we're taking the value of another sensor and converting it into a date time object. Usually what I'm doing though is taking a value like this Unix timestamp and converting it into a string that is human readable. As datetime is probably not all that useful for most of the templates you're going to be creating. As of right now, I'm not using as datetime in any of my active templates. But sometimes our entities store Unix timestamp, like the integration that tracks the International Space Station's current coordinates. For example, one of the attributes of this sensor for the International Space Station coordinates entity is timestamp. And if you wanted to use this value in a way that was human readable, you would need a way to convert this. And the asDateTime function could help you do that. So if we wrap all of this in the asDateTime function, you can see that it returns our value there. So before, we have a Unix timestamp, and after, the value of that timestamp is now human readable. But for the most part, I think you'll be using this as timestamp, because a lot of the date-time entities inside of Home Assistant, especially those related to services or entities, are going to be storing that information in a human readable string like this, because as timestamp takes a date-time entity or a string and converts it to that Unix timestamp, which makes that timestamp math really easy. For example, those date time helpers in which we've stored the date of a specific point in time. Here I've got a date time helper that has a specific date in the future. But if I wanted to know how many days I have until this point in time, I would need to be able to do some timestamp math. I would need to be able to subtract the current time stamp from this to get the difference in seconds between those 2 points in time. But of course, in this format, I really can't do that. And that's where that asTimestamp function comes in handy, because we can just wrap this specific datetime helper and get a Unix timestamp. Now, the caveat with asTimestamp is that it requires a date. You can't just use time. So if you have a datetime helper that just has time, then asTimestamp is not going to help you because it doesn't know the date. In this case, this specific datetime helper doesn't have a time, and that's okay, because asTimestamp will just assume that it's at midnight. And in fact, just to illustrate that, we're going to change this. And as you can see, it adds midnight to that timestamp, or to this entity. So anytime you use asTimestamp, whatever you pass to asTimestamp needs a date. If it doesn't, you're going to get an error. And now, if we wanted to know how much time there is between today and this particular point in time, we've converted our datetime helper to a Unix timestamp. Now, all we need to do is subtract, and I'm going to go to a second line for this, the current time in timestamp. So we're going to use that asTimestamp function and wrap our now function, which gets current time. And the output of this is the number of seconds between these 2 points in time, our date time helper and now, which of course doesn't really help you. But if we wrap all of this in a parentheses so that our template does this calculation first, and then we divide it by 86,400, which is the number of seconds in a day, we get the number of days until that point in time. But of course, if we're working with an entity that already has an attribute in the timestamp format, then we don't need to use asTimestamp. We can just reference the entity. For example, if we wanted to know if the last time we called an Amazon device using this date time helper in which I stored the timestamp, we can check to see if it was in the past by checking to see if that value is less than now. And since it is, this evaluates to true. Setting up your templates like this can be super handy as a condition in which you want to know if a specific event happened in the past or is going to happen in the future, and then use that to determine whether or not your automation fires. For example, perhaps you have an automation that you want to send a notification if someone has been in the same location for the last 24 hours. You could build out your automation with your notification, then in your condition put something like this, where we get the current time, we convert it to a Unix timestamp using our asTimestamp function, then we subtract the value of the last changed attribute for one of our person entities, in which we have to convert that to a timestamp as well, because if you remember, that's in the string format. And then we simply check to see if it's greater than the seconds in a day. And in this case, I have evidently been in the same location for more than 24 hours. You could also use this same pattern to check to see whether or not an automation has fired in the last 24 hours. In that case, we need to use the last triggered attribute. So in this case, again, we get the current time as a timestamp. We get the last triggered timestamp from this automation that fires anytime lightning is detected. And we check to see if it's greater than the seconds in a day. Because again, since we're working with timestamps, these Unix timestamps are a count of seconds. So we can easily subtract them and get a difference in seconds. So we'll need to convert that to something that makes more sense, or check to see if it's within the certain limit of seconds. And in this case, again, 24 hours, 86,400 seconds. And the result of this template is false. So if I had an automation that to let me know if lightning hasn't been detected in the last 24 hours, this would work. And if you have a critical automation that needs to fire every so often, this could be a good condition to add to an automation that lets you know when your automations haven't fired. And if you just wanted that information for a dashboard or a notification, you could simplify it and use the function relative time, which takes a date and time and tells you how long has passed that point in time. For example, if I wanted to know how long it's been since my automation clock chime has triggered, I could use this, where I get the attribute last triggered from that automation and use relative time. And as you can see, it's just now reset to 0 seconds, which means it just fired. There are a couple of caveats with relative time that make it not so useful. It only works with date and time in the past, and its output is general. So if something happened 1 day and 7 hours ago, this template would only give you 1 day as the output. So you would lose some precision using relative time. Of course, you'll probably want to check something else, like a calendar event. For example, I have a calendar for my kids' school schedule. Each school day has an event. This one gets a little bit trickier because the start time of a calendar event contains both the date and the time, and in this case, we just need to compare the date. As you can see here, I'm using the state attr function, my school calendar entity, along with the attribute start time, which gets a year, month, day, along with a time. Because I don't want the calendar events to be all day. That way I can put other school events on this calendar. So in this template, I create a couple of variables that I'm going to use a little bit later. So the first one I call next event. Here I use that as timestamp function to turn my start time of this calendar event, which is this string right here, into a Unix timestamp. And then I pipe to a timestamp underscore custom function, which I can pass in the format I want my timestamp to be in. In this function, timestamp underscore custom receives the string or the format we want to use. And again, it's using the Python shorthand for defining a time or date format, followed by this true, which tells it that I want to use local time. All of this is wrapped in our curly brace %, which means that this isn't going to output anything. And in fact, you can see that all we still have is this right here. So we haven't outputted anything else. All this minus or dash after the % does is it says to remove any white space prior to the output of this code. Next, we set another variable called today, and we set it to this now.date, which again, if you remember, would just get us this portion of the current timestamp. After that, all we have to do is compare the two. And just for illustration, this is what we're comparing. Next event, which outputs the date of our next event, and then today's date. And we can set it to this, where we just do that check inside of our double curly braces, which will simply output the value of this equation, where we're checking to see if next event is equal to today. And if it is, it would output true. Again, it's not, so we get false. And here is where I use that logic. And in fact, I've even changed this slightly, where I've set today to that sensor.date we talked about earlier. That's part of the time and date integration in Home Assistant. It outputs a string, so we can use it in this instead of the now.date that I showed off in the template panel. But the next event code is the same. We get the start time of our next calendar event. We're converting it to just the date, and then we compare the two. And the output of this sensor is going to be true or false. And the reality is, this probably should be a binary sensor. And of course, as you can notice, I haven't set it up in the new format, because there is a new format for setting up sensors. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the entity specific video, which should be the next one. And really, I think that's enough for this video. I hope it's given you enough to get started with your time and date-based templates. In fact, you could combine a couple of the concepts we've talked about in this video to build a template that could, say, give you the countdown of days until Halloween, using just that now function and some of the built-in functions we've talked about. But I'll save that for a future video where we start pulling all of these concepts together to build state-based template entities. Until then, go automate the boring stuff.